So welcome to our first panel of the afternoon in our different carousel that we're going to have. And it is going to be looking at how we drive change in different sectors. So just to introduce myself a little bit, I am Sian White and I'm Interim Co-Director of Research here at the Young Foundation. I lead on a range of different projects looking at national and local research projects, design projects, and also supporting some of our UKRI-funded projects as well. And I have a particular interest in how we think about participatory research and critically institutions' readiness for it. That's about the individuals that are involved in different practice, but also the sectors and the institutions themselves, which is why I'm so delighted to be on stage talking to our three different panelists today about exactly that topic of thinking a little bit about, with our different hats on in different sectors, actually what does community-driven research and innovation mean to those sectors? What's the state of it? What are the enabling factors that can build some of the conditions to do more of it? And also what can we learn from each other? So we'll be in conversation for the next little bit on those themes. But without further ado, I will introduce very briefly our panelists before I turn the attention over to them to actually properly introduce themselves and their experiences. So I'm delighted to be joined by, first of all, Professor Beth Parry, who is the Director of, I need to have that close to me, Director of Urban Institute over at the University of Sheffield, and also one of the co-leads for the Co-Pro Futures Inquiry, which we'll be hearing a little bit more about later, funded by Research England. We've got Claire Darnley, who's Head of Systems Change at the West Midlands Combined Authority, and you've actually just heard from one of the peer researchers, part of one of the projects that have been funded by Claire and her team. And I'm also delighted to be joined as well by Denise Ledette, who is the Director of the National Windrush Museum and part of UKRI-funded programme on mindsets and missions, looking at how we make changes within the museum and heritage sector as well. So we're going to have hopefully an interesting conversation over the next 40 or so minutes. You'll be glad you chose this session, I promise. Although how to top the one that we just had, but no pressure, guys. So I'd love to get into a bit of a conversation about your experiences in your different sectors, but also, where we might spot different commonalities. So I guess just to open us up and a starting kind of question, I'd love to understand a little bit more about what have you learned about what supports and also what gets in the way of community-driven research and innovation. And Beth, can I start with you?
Yeah, thank you very much. It's really lovely to be here with my co-panelists as well. It does feel like you've set us up quite heavily here for everyone to be so excited they chose this panel. So as you said, yes, I'm the Director of the Urban Institute. I'm also a Professor of Urban Epistemics, but I have to explain what that means because we're not allowed to use complex words, but basically my research is all about kind of the relationships between knowledge, power and inequalities in cities. And as you said, I'm specifically here today, I think, because I'm co-leading an inquiry funded by Research England called the Co-Pro Futures Inquiry with my colleagues at the Universities of Manchester, Liverpool and Sheffield, and Brian Evans-Myers, who's also in the audience here today. And what we're looking at is how can we create better sector-wide conditions for co-produced and participatory research within universities and higher education. And I know we'll get into that a bit more in more detail later, because you've sort of asked us to focus a bit more on why we think this inquiry is needed in the first instance. And it's interesting being here today at an event sponsored by UKRI, because UKRI have obviously been thinking about this for like a long time, over 20 years. And it's really relevant, like with Rachel Reeves's announcement at the moment about the kind of regionalisation of science policy and development of local science funds. We've obviously seen a huge amount of change in the last 20 years with programmes like the AHRC's Connected Communities or ESRC Urban Transformations. And I've been the beneficiary of some of these programmes, which has really led me to think about how do we get our own house in order? And I think that's the big question that we're trying to address through our inquiry. And partly that's because we had, myself and my co-leads, Catherine and Liz, we had a project called Jam and Justice, Co-Producing Urban Governance in Social Innovation in Greater Manchester. And we would have brought together an action research collective of people across sectors. So 15 people, community activists, people in policy, academics, all kinds of people, to think about how we could make devolution matter for local people. And what does citizen participation mean in research, but also in local government, which I think is where we connect, and with other organisations as well. And so that really means this kind of systems view on how different individuals with different expertise in different kinds of institutions can work together to produce collective intelligence. And I think one of the biggest things we've learned is about those kinds of systemic points for change. And I just thought I'd pull out a few of them here. And I mean, for me, it really goes to the question in the name of this conference, boundaries, right? And actually, I think boundaries are sometimes helpful and sometimes they're not. And when we're pushing boundaries, we need to be clear about what we let go of and what we embrace, because sometimes boundaries help us do our work really well. And I just want to pick up a couple of them. So, individual boundaries. The first thing I've learned in it sounds so simple is be human. We're here to talk about sectors and institutions, but they don't matter if you connect with people at the level of human experience. And I think there's a tendency, even now, with all this amazing research funding that's available, to see people as fixes to a research design or a research project rather than really connecting with who people are. And this echoes what was said just in the panel beforehand. So we really need to think about people on their own distinct journey, not as assets or just tokens or as fixers for some sort of research design. And that goes both ways, because we as professionals, we also have lived experience. We also have complex lives. Sometimes we just get put in a professional or an academic box, and actually we all need to work much better together across those individual boundaries and mindsets for any of this stuff to work. That then means working differently in our organisations. So that might mean agitating for change, overcoming the boundaries between frontline service staff and strategic roles, or between academics and professional support staffs. That's a theme that's come through really clearly for us. And it's also then about building those coalitions of change between different organisations. So sector joint working doesn't necessarily happen through institutional leaders deciding to work together. It comes together when individuals try to do something a bit different and they find the other like-minded individuals who they can forge a coalition of the willing with. I think also, this is a really boring thing, is about recognising how institutions actually work in different sectors. I think we need institutional empathy. You know, we need to be a bit sensitive and understanding about the constraints and conditions we're working under, like local government authority funding, the cultural sector, universities. We've all had our funding slashed repeatedly over many years. And sometimes, actually, it's really boring, but real innovation, I think, and through our experience, is linked to extremely dull bureaucratic things, like finding these tiny little micro moments of change. That's how you get big system change, is through individuals finding the really dull stuff. So institutional design matters, like how do we pay people? How do we structure things? How do we reward people in institutions? What's the next deadline that they've got to jump through, otherwise they're going to get their funding cut? And we need to spend much more time at the beginning of projects, not just getting to know each other, but getting to know our institutions. And that's going to make some of this cross-sector stuff work. And then we need more flexible institutions to go along with that. So I've probably talked up to my time. I'll hand over to someone else, but maybe we can bring some other things in the conversation.
Thanks so much there for kicking us off, Beth. Loads that we can jump into, and I'm looking forward to getting to conversation about it. You mentioned systems change quite a lot there, and so with that, shall I hand over to someone that has the title of Head of Systems Change?
Yeah, I got a lot of LinkedIn posts about computer systems and systems change, but that's not my job. I'm the head of system change and inclusion at the West Midlands Combined Authority. The Combined Authority is a mayoral combined authority, otherwise known as a strategic authority. So our mayor has 4 key priorities. They kind of sum up what we do, or the majority of what we do. He talks about journeys for everyone, growths for everyone, jobs for everyone, and homes for everyone. And in a nutshell, me and my team bring to life the everyone means everyone within the mayor's pledges. Um, when I try and think about kind of what are the key skills, or what do I spend most of my time doing, the sort of 4 key words that resonate with my day-to-day job, I tend to agitate a lot. I innovate, I amplify, and I connect. And that seems to be what we spend a lot of our time doing. I lead 3 sort of main programs of work. One is all of our equality, diversity, and inclusion work. So when we think about things like creating growth plans, applying, we heard earlier Hannah talking about health and equity impact assessment. So my team will deliver the health and equity impact assessments on things like the growth plan or our skills agenda, and really bring that to life through inclusive approaches. You met one of our peer researchers earlier, by thinking about what does this mean in communities? And there's a real translation piece between some of our colleagues who talk about agglomeration and polycentric regions and what that means for real people who can understand that and translate that into their lives. I lead a programme of work on, the government call it public service reform. We don't really like calling the word reform, so we're calling it public sector innovation. So we've got a whole programme of work thinking about complexity and demand in systems and really drilling down into names, not numbers, and what that means for people. And then a programme of work on inclusive communities. So thinking about how do we put on an equal footing some of those principles around social inclusion, social infrastructure, social capital, social mobility, alongside things like our growth plan and our skills plan. But you didn't ask me to describe my job. You asked me about how we can think about what might be some supportive factors and perhaps what might get in the way of thinking about community-driven research and innovation within a sector like mine in the public sector. So first off, I think there's something about absolutely putting residents first and at the heart of everything that we do. So that example around thinking about our growth plans, a sector of work that is typically driven by academics or policymakers, and how we can bring that to life for our residents. Bringing it to life for our residents, embedding it within our residents' lives, and making sure that it becomes community focused in the way that we do that. So putting residents first, absolutely. Collaboration is key. So I've got an incredible team. They are driven, high performing, resilient in bucket loads, have a passion, build movement, agitate, innovate, connect, amplify. So having that kind of team is really important as something that's supportive in this sector. But also that collaboration with our partners. So thinking about all of our sectors, our local authority partners, our voluntary community, faith, social enterprise sectors, community organisations, our business sectors, really thinking about kind of everything that we do. So a really good example, we had hosted the Commonwealth Games in Birmingham in 2022. If you didn't come, you missed a trick there. It was brilliant. We underspent on it, which was brilliant. We brought in just over 70 million back into the region, and of that, about 20 million came into an inclusive communities pillar. 11.8 million of that was then sent back out to 388 community organisations by way of a grant programme, benefited over 500,000 people, residents. A big part of that decision-making process was a community panel. So applications for the grant went through the community panel. The grant itself was designed with and for our community members. I think my third point would be about building cross-party support. I work for a public sector organisation. We have a directly elected mayor. Things change. We had a Conservative mayor up until May last year, and then it was a big news story. I think there's about 100 votes in it. We changed to be a Labour mayor. In order for some of our initiatives around the way in which we view and value communities in our policy development has to be embedded as business as usual, so that it doesn't become a political easily to dispose of at a political will. So something like our Young Combined Authority was initiated through our previous mayor's leadership commission, very much an initiative that he was passionate about, but because we've embedded it and improved the use of it through things like our Trailblazer Deeper Devolution deal, our transport infrastructure plans and concessions, we were able to. It made it too difficult to get rid of. It was part of our DNA. I think there's something about ambition with vision. So making sure that we connect that things like the way in which we do things in our. I'm waffling. There's something around when we're doing something, we need to really achieve it and make sure that our vision is achievable, that our ambitions are high. And when we're working with communities, we've really got to kind of prove ourselves to them. So a really tricky space that we've done some of this work in is around a race equalities task force. So West Midlands is the most diverse area outside of London. 45% of our residents don't identify as being white British. There are over 200 or 300 languages spoken across the region. So it's really important for us to make sure that we have an ambition that the West Midlands is a place where everybody can flourish and achieve their potential. And sort of connecting those things has been really important. And then I think there's something around holding the tension. So some of the work that we learned through working with the Race Equalities Task Force is that there's a high level of fear, distrust, uh, hurt, and holding those hurts, creating the space where we can hold some of those hurts has been really important to thinking about how we embed some of this work. Um, Thinking about what gets in the way, I work for a public sector organisation, so bureaucracy has to be top of my list. Um, our organisation was born out of a transport authority. They were really used to commissioning metros, trains, big infrastructure projects. So to then start to talk to my organisation around some of the work we were interested in doing that thinks about social infrastructure, social capital, equity and inclusion, our legal procurement, etc., became quite challenging. So that is a significant thing. We've found ways around it, but those bureaucratic processes can be tricky. I think there's something around the value that people have, and we've talked about it a lot today, the way in which people view community-driven research, and the views and values of our communities and how much weight that has. It still feels like a nice to do rather than an essential, and the way in which we need to land that as an essential all of the time and fund it to the same level that we would fund statistical data, traditional research. Yeah, I think that's probably me.
Thank you so much there, Claire, for talking a little bit about your experience, and we'll pick up on some of those themes shortly. For our last panelist, Denise, can I hand over to you to say a little bit about yourself and your experience?
Good afternoon, everyone. And you will have to forgive me if I repeat anything that happened this morning because I wasn't at the earlier sessions, but I can already hear some resonance from my panelists. I'm the museum's director of the National Windrush Museum, and we were born out of R&I. I'm not going to give you statistics in the spirit of collaboration, no stats, no definitions. I'm going to tell you a story. The story is about our being born. Research why we looked at the terrain across the museum landscape and saw that there were about 2,500 museums, and we weren't in any of those museums. So we had to respond to that specifically. We have a lot of work on Windrush across the country, but a lot of that work is also very ephemeral. So it disappears. A case in point, Notting Hill is an enormous undertaking. And if you turn up the week after, you will never know that Notting Hill actually occurred the week before. That has been, that mirrors a lot of our Windrush narrative over the years. So we had to bring ourselves into being out of those 2,500 institutions, 2,500 ways that a nation has to tell itself who it is and to speak to its identity. And why is that important? Because in terms of research, it's very much feeding into that river of identity and who we are and what we do and why we do and how we do. And so there's an inextricable link between research and a lot of those established institutions. So you can already see at a foundational level, we're already not represented in that. And I often use analogies of rivers and streams. These sort of streams flow into bigger streams, flow into rivers, and then river goes to the sea. British history is that, and we weren't included in that. Nevertheless, we've been there in all those parallels for over the last 500 years. So it was necessary for us to look at what we wanted to say about our community, but legacy was very important to us. We were part of a Mindsets and Missions pilot, which was funded by UKRI. And I give you the background context about the museum and us bringing ourselves into being in order to show you where we're coming from when it comes to a research perspective. We've been in place for the last 3 years, but we've travelled at pace, and there are a number of things that I'll touch on during the conversation that will demonstrate, the pace that we're moving at, because we're very mindful about time. We are losing the majority of our pioneers, and a group that I call the new elders, that's a loose terminology, we are also moving at an alarming rate. And so therefore we need to ensure that we can communicate to our next generation what they need to understand about what has happened thus far. That's our form of research. I never use the research in any of the work we do with our community because we've been extremely over researched. And if I speak about any kind of research, that's an immediate no. People are leaving. People do not want to engage. There's a lot of, the point was made about mistrust, so really picking up on some of those points. We are from the community. Our board is drawn from the Windrush elders. We understood that it was necessary to speak to the diversity of our community. We may be from the community, it doesn't give us an instant pass. We had to win the trust. We had to do the work to get the trust that researchers come to us for, to engage with our communities. So I'm very careful with that trust. And there are a lot of projects and initiatives that I absolutely will not engage with if once we have conversations, we see that the mechanism isn't appropriate for us to move forward. So that mistrust meant that we had to shape different ways of engaging with our community to be able to understand what their needs were. I don't get an automatic pass. We come from a diversity of islands, we come from a diversity of age ranges, demographics, etc. We're not a homogenous group. And it's very important that we take that stance internally so that when we're speaking and engaging with external agencies, that there's value in that. So 3 years in, and our mindsets and mission, we had some really grand ambitions because very infrequently are you given an opportunity to have a blank sheet in terms of a project. So we were very ambitious about what we wanted to do. And so we focused on content. We were going to get this great amount of content to present. And then we had to take several steps back because if you don't have a foundation of trust with the institution and with the individuals you're working with, that content is just surface level. There's no value in that content. So we had to mine our own communities in different ways. Essentially, we were doing the work through the work. Had to engage at that level with people. But we realized that trust building exercise was very deeply embedded and it was very, very impactful. And at every stage of any initiative we had to take 2 steps back and ensure that we were taking people with us in terms of reflecting what they felt they needed at this stage of their lives and how they wanted to be represented. And we've developed that in many different ways, and I'll elaborate on that further. But in terms of obstacles, or I would say hindrances to the process, it was touched on before, value, the value attributed to academic research as opposed to community-driven work. Research, which I understand has been sort of discussed a great deal this morning, but I'm here to reiterate that the way the funding models are not 3 to 5 year models, but perhaps a year, a 12-month project, and you've got to get everything right within that project, and you're just getting started, and then your resources are gone, and therefore you're not able to continue. It does give a notion of what we consider valuable. So it's not valuable enough to invest in long term. And so people respond to that. And then you're constrained by that because often once you've got that foundation, that's now the implementation is the second phase of that. And that phase is what will give you the richness and which will give you a foundation for growth moving forward. Then that becomes an agency that you can go back to because it's got solid foundations. But the absence of that means that institutions and organizations are continually focused on chasing the funding and not really in a position to respond to the needs of the community. And that is going to be constantly changing because, as I said, it's the diversity within the community that's valuable. And that is what will give you the valuable data at the end of the day to be able to access that. But you need a gateway to be able to do that, and the gateway needs to be resourced. In terms of what helps, I think certainly the pilot that we were a part of, that flexibility to say, to be told, shape something from the outset. That was a really valuable mechanism, and we've found ways to ensure that that kickstart in terms of our research process has evolved. And I will elaborate further on how it's actually evolved. I will say that in terms of the museum, recognizing the demographics and the diversity, we have three aspects of our management strategy that reflects. We have a development council that consists of a number of individuals who've been relatively successful, who act as ambassadors, but they come with a very specific perspective. Then we have a board, and that board has a series of academics as well as activists and individuals that are artists. So really quite diverse group with the board. And then we have a next gen council. Now these three work in parallel in everything that we do, so that we're sure that we're looking at the diversity of the audience that we're engaging with. So that's our starting point. And the fact that we innovated ourselves into being, we continue to innovate, is very much a reflection of how our parents survived when they migrated to the UK. It's always been innovating in the absence of resources that were dedicated to them. So it's ironic that almost a generation behind them, we are innovating in exactly the same way that they were tasked to do when they emerged. And we're keen to try and support our next gen so that they're not doing the same thing, because it takes time. And that valuable resource means that we should have been further along. But the fact that 75 years later, after the actual iconic Empire Windrush, HMS Windrush arrived, we had to birth a museum to record that specific narrative. So we're coming at research from a really different perspective than others, and we can elaborate that across the conversation. Thank you.
Quite right. Some amazing rich reflections just starting us off there. I guess to try and draw some links then across kind of your different experiences and get us into kind of conversation, I'm struck in a way by this interesting tension of, I guess, the fact that we're talking about kind of institutions, but quite often it is about the role of individuals within them that are trying to drive that change, to work differently, to be agitators, a phrase that's been used across. And I'd be interested in kind of your reflections as panelists about what it feels like to sometimes be the people driving that change, and what could be done to best support you, to connect you, what enables that. I'd be very interested if anyone wants to start us off.
I'm happy
Go
to.
for it.
Yeah, I'm happy to. There's a word that we, across many Black communities, and some people may resonate with that, and the word is tired. You know, just tired. This work has been going on for a long time. But I do think that the point you made earlier in terms of there is some change on the horizon. So it's not all doom and gloom. There is change. It's slow, but there is change. But people are tired. They want, these are real issues. You know, they're not academic issues. They're not academic constructs. It's not a thesis. The work we have to do impacts on people's real lives. And sometimes that's a heavy responsibility, because you know that if you are engaged in a particular case or a particular initiative or project, there's a real outcome. Certainly for us, we are currently in the midst of delivering a Windrush Summit. So literally 2 days' time, I will be at the Home Office speaking to them about the government and the Home Office Windrush scandal. That's real life. You know, people lost their lives, their homes, their possessions, their people, moved out of the system entirely. And so there's a lot of research around that. And one of the things I'm quite keen to do is to collate that, to present it. But that, if there ever was an example of the tiredness, that would be one. Everyone at every level of that whole process is tired, is fatigued. The community is also tired of being researched. And the reason that is because out of that research, traditionally, very little has evolved. We've had a conversation, we've worked out your needs, we see what they are, they're clearly articulated, we have several reports, but the action doesn't come. And that's where the tiredness happens. I think people have been happy to contribute to the narrative, but they want something from that. What was it contributing for? Are we going to do another report? And out of that report, what will we get? And so that's why I can never say the word research when I'm speaking to my community, because not interested. So how do we move forward? We move forward by doing things. So we've had a conversation. We've looked at the Home Office Windrush scandal. What is our response? To bring a conference in that space to allow people to voice their concerns in the very space that birthed the scandal. That has been very challenging. The Home Office does not have a good reputation across the Windrush community, and that has been for some time. So it's very much, I go back to this essence of doing and reviewing, doing, engaging, doing, reflecting, doing, failing, doing, winning, but doing. So, not to coin a phrase of a very important or very successful sports sports entity, we just do it. That's the way. And that's the way we've earned the trust of our community, by moving from the talking to the doing, because that is what has been missing over the years.
Thank you, Denise. Go for it, Claire.
I think this. I think I talked about my team being really resilient, and I think that kind of echoes the tired feeling. We're within the system, and we have to be quite resilient within the system to keep pushing at those boundaries. We've got a bit of a mantra within our team around creating space to feel comfortable when things get uncomfortable, and is it really riskier to let communities lead, or is it just uncomfortable for people? And so helping our leaders, helping our politicians to feel comfortable in spaces that they perhaps otherwise would feel uncomfortable, embracing that, and trying to look for the relationships, look for the innovation, look for the way forward. We talk quite a lot about echo chambers, and one of the challenges that I think we often have in some organisations, particularly at higher levels in organisations, is we can recruit in our own image, we can create echo chambers, and I think we've worked quite hard as an organisation to try and not to do that, and to create opportunities for us to be a little bit more humble, to challenge each other, to learn how we can hear different voices and different opinions, and to embed that within our work. And that's been, I don't think we're all the way there. It's been a long process. I think it will continue to be a process, but I think that's really important to challenge each of ourselves to not create that echo chamber, and to think about, when did you last feel uncomfortable, and how do you get yourself into that space where you can find something positive and productive from that feeling of being a bit uncomfortable.
Thank you, Claire.
Yeah, I'm just reflecting on who is the we of the academics that's doing this kind of research, doing co-produced and participatory research. And often they are people that really understand the social justice issues at stake. They feel that sense of massive urgency. They want to get things done. I think they're lonely. That's the word that's come through and isolated, come through our Co-Pro Futures inquiry so far. Because they feel like they're shouting into the wilderness and their systems in their institutions don't have their back. So we found time and time again that individuals are trying to do research in a really ethical way to produce social justice outcomes, despite, not because of the institution. There's this real missing middle between how the organisation and the sector works and the conditions that they require to produce it. And so they fall back on peer support, on tactics, on craftiness, on hacks, trying to get around the system. And we've seen a huge amount of progress in universities providing better infrastructure, for instance, to engage with policymakers or to engage with economic development agencies. but we haven't cottoned on to what's needed to engage with communities, and it's not the same thing. We keep getting fed these single stop shop type ideas. That's not how it works. That's not how you build trust. And I don't think we yet know how the institution can have individuals' backs, but at the moment, most people feel that it doesn't. And that's really where some of the idea of our inquiry came from, because we thought we need collective intelligence. So it's not just one story, it's not just two story, it's lots of people saying funding matters, equitable partnerships matter, it matters how we value research, it matters like how we think about impact and what that looks like so we can recast it. So our goal is to try and collectivize intelligence and collectivize the kind of peer support networks so that people aren't so individualized and isolated, because actually we talk about funding a lot, we don't talk about time, but that urgency question is really important. And to do that, we need to have the sort of infrastructures to act more quickly.
Picking up on that theme there, I guess you've all kind of mentioned the funding word, the big word, and also I guess kind of the idea of like how do you find space for these initiatives that actually are a little bit different, and I guess critically where that might involve working differently, breaking some of the rules, being a bit crafty about how you do it. I'd be really interested in kind of your reflections about where the opportunities are, I guess, to do a bit of that, but critically, how do we get beyond that? How do we scale it? Where are the opportunities to actually do more than simply the one-off? We got a mini chance to do this. It sounds like you're all doing that in your practice, but I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of actually your reflections on how do we do more of that.
There's definitely something about tactical sneakiness. So how do you create systems and processes that um, embed community approaches, but kind of hide it a little bit from people that might be some of the blockers, particularly in an organisation like mine, which is full of bureaucracy. How do we make it happen and then celebrate it, make it too hard to stop doing, share the kind of successes and the wins. Some of our biggest advocates now are some of my colleagues in legal and procurement, because they've seen the impact that some of the work has had. They were some of our initial, blockers. The kind of tactical sneakiness and then sharing success and being humble about it and celebrating other people's roles in it. I think there's something about making it too hard to stop doing. We've embedded it within our health and equity impact assessment process. We've got a number of pieces of work like the Young Combined Authority that are cross-party, very very well supported. It's part of our DNA now. It's too difficult to stop doing it. So I think there's some of the key things about how do we embed it. It can be lonely. It can be tricky.
Beth.
I think I'd say we can have more, but it's not always about more. So in a community-driven R&I system, there's all kinds of different research happens. Think given the kind of nature of the questions that we're facing, the big societal challenges, I don't think everything can be co-produced. And so I think we need to be careful about the more, and where it's about better conditions, better quality, better ethics. It's also about recognising who's doing the work. It's very gendered, which is something that's come through our inquiry very strongly. It's a lot of ECRs who are kind of pushing this work as well. And I think we need to grapple with some of those kinds of questions about where the burden lies. You used the word attributed value. So how is this stuff valued? How is the value of things expressed, and how is it valued in our institutions? And I think we really need to think about some of those reward and incentive structures in order to crack some of this piece as well.
Thank you.
I would say our take on that would be partnerships. We have a partnership with the Royal Museums Greenwich, so we have an MOU with them, and we're actually based inside the National Maritime Museum, working on the construct that Windrush history is maritime history, is British history. We also have an MOU with the University of Greenwich. We have an MOU with the University of the West Indies. We're exploring partnerships with Peabody Trust. So it's the partnerships that give us the leverage. Even when we developed this summit in partnership, we had to work in partnership with the Home Office, which was an absolute no-no, but here we are. And it's continually leveraging these partnerships, working very closely, because we can see that even in the doing, before we've even delivered the conference, we can see, and they've told us how much they've already learned from the process. Embedding ourselves in terms of museology, being able to be mentored by a major established international national museum is important to our growth, because these are pathways that we've been denied access to. So these significant partnerships act as catalysts to be able to facilitate our continual moving at speed. So partnership has been the way that we've learned, moved, and leveraged resources to be able to keep evolving.
Thank you there, Denise. And I think that bridges us maybe to a final kind of question for our panel, which is, I've been asking you questions, slightly maybe unfairly, about, with your sector hats on, kind of what's your perspective, but conscious that there is a lot of emphasis right now around the idea of actually where is the opportunities for cross-sector collaboration and community-driven research and innovation. I would just be interested in your kind of reflections on, I guess, where you see some of those opportunities and benefits, but also putting your hats back on, I guess, kind of where still there is that value in any of thinking about the uniqueness and roles of different sectors. Um, would anyone like to take that? Oh, Beth, there you go.
I don't mind, but I mean, I wasn't going to give an exact answer, just a reflection from some of the work I'm doing with schools, looking at how schools are social infrastructure in their urban environments and how they're working with universities. And there's two different models. One is schools trying to respond to community needs as they come up. And that's very much about patching together the partnerships that they need to address the problem that they have. So it's not a big grand design, cross-sector collaboration. What do we need to address this problem for these communities at this moment in time? Other schools have established big partnerships, like in Bradford, to bring everybody around the table to design it from the top down. And those are very different kinds of models. So I think we need to be quite careful about the strategic sort of cross-sector collaboration piece and the bottom-up kind of more driven by needs piece. And for me, it's about flexible adaptive systems that is most appropriate for that particular scenario. Because as soon as you structure something, you solidify it and it risks becoming hard and porous and people can't get involved.
Thanks, Beth. Claire, looks like you. Yep.
For me, I think it's just the bit about empowering communities, thinking about place, sort of a nice segue into your next session. So for me, it's not just place, it's people and place. All of our local authorities at the moment are preparing their place-based strategies or finalising them. It's got to be about people and place. It's got to be about people in place. So just keeping that narrative there. And also, congratulations on running a panel without us talking about microplastics at all. We've done really well.
Okay, I said that we operate by doing, and the summit that we have now is an illustration. All of the work we've done has been an illustration of a doing. The summit was developed in partnership, as I said, with all these different agencies. So the Home Office, because we're looking specifically at the Home Office Windrush scandal. The second day of the conference is at Greenwich University, and that brings in the community side of it. So we've got the community in the Home Office, but now we've got the community in the university, which is academia. And then the Next Gen, their translation was to work with a hotel and to bring in poets and to translate. They've commissioned their poets to write specifically about the scandal. So there's a continuity, but each group is responding, and we're working with different agencies. The hotel, again, a partner that we brought on board. So it's the doing. And for us, it will always be through the doing. And then we respond.
Thank you very much to all of our speakers for sharing their insights, their experiences, and their honesty. I'm sure we could actually continue this conversation right the way through, but I'm aware that we've got to go to a tea break to give you a cup of tea and some coffee. But I just would like to reflect just a couple of things that have just emerged from this kind of conversation. And I guess probably thinking about, for some of you that are in this room, coming to the session thinking, I'm sitting in similar kind of organisations or settings trying to drive change. And hopefully what this has given you is some both food for thought about what you might be able to do in your individual roles, but also to know that others out there are trying to do similar things. I was going to end on a kind of a question of thinking about what does it take institutions to be participation ready, but I think kind of our panellists have given us some interesting food for thought about where the support is for the individuals that are really trying to drive that change, and how do we not forget, I guess, in the kind of the urgency, the absolute critical urgency to create some of these changes, how we think about a little bit that with the empathy for the individuals that are trying to drive that without forgetting it's time to just do it. On that, shall we end and go to our tea break? And thank you so much again for our panelists.
Thank you.